Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Itamar, it's Friday. We are in Parashat Vayetze. It's just, when this terrible tragedy began, when the evil Hamas devils crossed over into the southern part of Israel, the first thing that came to mind when I heard about this tragedy was that this event is biblical. It's something that's way beyond our grasp. I mean, the level of evil and you read it's something that's so hard to grasp, how there can be such evil people in the world to do such terrible atrocities. And this week, obviously, since the beginning of the war, Israel made a couple of different conditions with why they're going to war. And number one, which is to totally eliminate Hamas, this evil devil force, which is like the Nazis, ISIS, and Israel is declared that they will eliminate them, their entire political, their political existence and their military existence in every way. There won't be any more Hamas in control over Gaza. And in addition, of course, at the same time, the importance of releasing the hostages, which will be obviously the major topic today of our lesson, since that's what's going on right now in Israel, the current events. And then, of course, eventually when the war is over, to make sure that there'll be no more evil forces in Gaza anymore that are going to be able to do something again to what was done to us in the past. We'll talk about that, of course, when the war is over, and there's more time to discuss what's going to be, because obviously the normal thing would be is to Israel to return to its borders that were uprooted from us, and our precious residents that were thrown out of their homes from Gush Katif and Hevel Aza. But I want to focus today, as I mentioned, on the hostage situation. And well, of course, we relate it to the portion. And I want to we always see that there are always signs in every portion of the week. We've discussed this many times, the deep connection between the portion. All you have to do is look deeply into the portion. You will see parallels to what's going on. And number one, we see this portion is extremely full of events that are surrounded by deals, making all kinds of deals. And here we're talking about the hostage deal, obviously. And number one, and I want to begin to show just a few examples how this portion is saturated with examples of making deals, this whole portion. I'll give an example. If we look in Genesis 28, verse number 20 to 22, it says, Jacob, Vayidar Yaakov Neder, Jacob makes an oath. And he says, if God is going to be with me and watch me, where I'm going, and will give me bread and to eat and garments, V'shafti b'shalom el Beit Avi, then I'll return home to my home. Right? Jacob is going now to exile. If I return home, and God will be with me, then this stone here will become a matzeva, will become a memorial, right? And this will be the house of God. And everything that I get, I will give a tithings. So Jacob is making a deal. He's making a deal here by making an oath to God. Take care of me and I will do this. So it's a certain kind of deal that he's making with God over here at the opening of the portion. If we go on, we'll see another example in chapter 29, verse 18. It says, Vayehav Yaakov et Rachel. Jacob loves Rachel. And he tells Lavan, I will work for 7 years. Right? He's making a deal with Lavan for a price to have his wife. Of course, Lavan is a criminal and crook, and he keeps reversing things and changing things around. But anyway, here, of course, they're all about the dealings with Yaakov and Lavan. And here's the first one regarding Rachel. Then he, of course, when he's given Leah, he has to work another 7 years, right? They're making more deals. And so that, obviously, around the Jacob's finding his wives, we see a lot of dealings going on over there as well. If we look further in chapter 30, in verse number 14 to 16, we see Vayelech Reuven b'mei Ktsir Chitim. Right, Reuben goes out, and it's the time of the wheat harvest, and he finds mandrakes in the field, and he brings them to his mother Leah, And Rachel sees these mandrakes, and she right away makes a deal. Can you give me those mandrakes? So Leah makes a deal with her and saying, okay, you want the mandrakes? It's not enough that my husband, Jacob, of course, there was tension between the sisters a little bit over who shares the love of Jacob with. So she goes, it's not enough that he's with you all the time, but you want to take my mandrakes. So they make a deal, and she gives Rachel the mandrakes, and Rachel allows Yaakov to be with her that night. And then Yisachar is born. So we see another deal, another kind of business deal is being made over here. Okay. If we go further down, I'm just bringing a few more examples. If we look in chapter 30, verse number 25 to verse number 28, we see it says when Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob goes over to Lavan and says, send me away. I want to go back to my land. Give me my wives, whatever salary is coming to him, right? I work for you. And so Lavan says, okay, what do you want? So we see here they're making again a deal to release Jacob. He's in a kind of bondage and a kind of captivity, and he has to be released from that. And they're making a deal, and of course, we know 1,000 times the deal is reversed over and over again by Lavan, as Jacob testifies. It has been so many times, 10 times that he changed his tactics 10 times, his salary, what they promised him. So anyway, if we go further down and towards the end, we'll see the final example of the dealings, and I keep mentioning a good few of them. We see in chapter 31, where Lavan tells Yaakov, these are my daughters, these are my sons, these are my flocks, everything is his. Of course, right away, Lavan and his concept, everything belongs to him. And he goes on and he says, let's make a covenant, right, as a testimony between us. And they make the covenant again. Here's another deal of making this covenant. Not going to trespass. Jacob has rules he has to follow as Lavan requests, and all those kind of things. And they actually make this covenant, and they have a meal over it, whatever it is. So we see throughout the portion there, the atmosphere within the portion is all about deals, different kind of dealings. And of course, I can just go here to discuss that, but I wanted today focus more on the hostage deal and that kind of thing right now. But I should mention, there's one point I do want to mention here right away, is we see in the beginning that sort of Jacob making this conditioning with God after God promises to bring him back. But Jacob is making an oath, if you do bring me back, it sort of seems to be a lack of faith here. We spoke about this in the past. But at the end, after making this, we see that in the beginning it opens up with Jacob with the, by this matzeva, by this, matzeva refers to a stone memorial, kind of not a memorial, but it can be, but a stone structure, right, called the matzeva, where they would actually, in the past, they even bring offerings there. And the end of the portion ends with that same way, by being forced into an agreement with Lavan, also centered around a matzeva, centered around a mound of stone. So that's an interesting point to make a connection here between the two things. And as we all know, God does measure for measure. And maybe there's a little hint here as well, which I didn't really look into, have to think about this concept, that perhaps God, was reminding Jacob right before he came back, about his matzeva that he made, and, comparing it to the one of Laban at the end, Lavan. But anyway, this is an interesting topic in itself to pay attention to. But I want to get now into the hostage understanding a little bit about what's going on with the hostage situation in Israel, and to describe what's happening, to see how Jewish law relates to this, and we'll see how we connect that back to the portion. But I'd like to begin with some source work on this. And number one, we should all know that obviously the pain that our people are going through now, to think about children, little babies that need their mothers and hostage, women, elderly, Holocaust survivors, the suffering for almost 2 months, being in captivity in the worst places with the worst devils that are possible, such evil people, that the atrocities they committed, we can just imagine their appetite, what it is to hold on to a hostage still alive, just because they want to use it for obviously to save their own skin, but the hatred that they have and the evil. and what all those poor, suffering people are going through right now. And of course, the terrible tension within the families. Every moment, not being able to sleep at night. What's happening to my child? What's going on to my mother, to my father? You know, all these thoughts that are racing through the mind of people that feel their loved ones that are right now in captivity. Of course, the people of Israel, they're all our children, they're all our parents, they're all our brothers and sisters out there. But there's nothing more painful than someone who knows them personally, a family member who's so close to them. They feel it much more than those who, of course, feel the pain, but it's not the same thing, obviously. And that terrible situation is hard to fathom what they're going through. And in the past, there's always been hostage situation in Israel. We've been experienced many situations of Israel making deals for Gilad Shalit, and we know situations where Israel went to rescue the hostages of Entebbe, and other deals as well. Many different deals that we can talk about throughout the history of modern Israel. But let's go back to the biblical history and see. First, let's begin to see how our forefathers related to this situation. So I want to bring, first of all, some source work regarding captivity, what our forefathers did. And we'll start there. I'd like to bring, of course, something we read not too long ago, the story of Abraham. And it's very, very simple. Abraham hears that his nephew Lot is taken captivity, and he goes to battle because of that. And that we all know we just read about it recently. So we see the response of Abraham was, he goes to battle, he takes his soldiers with him, and they go all the way to Damascus, Eliezer, and Abraham releases Lot from captivity. So the response that Abraham reacted to a nephew in captivity was to attack the enemy. If we go to the story, the most powerful story, the most, I would say, descriptive story in the Bible, I think would be in the book of Samuel, chapter 30. And I'd like to read some of this to go through with you, how King David reacts to captivity. And we'll see a couple of, I'd like to read some of these verses. It says, Vahi bavo David vanashav Siklag. King David, they came with his men to a place called Siklag. Okay? Siklag, we're talking about the area probably more in the southern part of Israel. We all know, King David did, he was the king of all of Israel, partly in Hebron and lately of all of Israel. But here we're talking about when he was in a place called Siklag. And let's go on from here. So it says, just one second, I want to open up the Bible itself here. Okay, and it goes on to say like this. It was on the third day. And the Amaleks, they came to the southern part of Israel, the Negev. And they burnt down the city, they struck the city, and they burnt the city by fire. Okay. And they took captivity the women. From the young until the older, so all the women, whether little girls till the elderly, lo emitu ish, they didn't kill anybody. They took all the women captivity. And they went along. And David comes back with his soldiers to the city, and they find the city totally burnt down, and the women and their children, their sons and daughters, in captivity. And King David and the people with him, they lifted their voices in terrible, terrible crying. Until there was no more strength anymore to cry. This is exactly what is going on here in Israel. Families are crying until they can't cry anymore. This is exactly the description here. The two wives of King David were in captivity as well. Achinoam Israelite v'Avigail eshet Naval haKarmeli. They went into captivity, the two wives of King David. Achinoam and Avigail, those two wives of his. We know he had more than those, but those are the ones in captivity. Vateitze leDavid ma'od. And King David was in terrible distress. Ki amru ha'am l'saklo ki mara nefesh kol am. The nation was so upset they wanted to stone him. Right? Obviously also on his the entire nation, they wanted to stone King David because they were so upset. Everyone about their children, etc. But if we pay attention here also, this is very similar to the demonstrations in Israel, and they're yelling at Netanyahu, "We want our families home." It's obviously the frustration of families, which we can't, in one way, say anything to them, and they're in such distress. So King David felt that as well. Vayomer David el Evyatar Kohen. So King David says to Evyatar, the priest, Ben Achimelech, the son of Achimelech, bring me the ephod. And he gives him the ephod, right? The ephod, as we all know, has the breastplate, and that's really what they would, Choshen Mishpat, and they would able to ask questions and find what's going on. And King David, in verse 8, says he asks God, and he asks God if I should run after these Amalekim, would I be successful in getting them? And God says, yes, do so, and etc. And King David, Vayelech David hu v'sheshmot ish. King David takes 600 special forces, soldiers that were with him. Vayavo el anachal abso. It's all in the Negev. This is really interesting. This is all happening in the southern part here of Israel, reminding us what's going on in Gaza in the south. Vanotarim amadu. Right, so he took 600 people. The rest stayed back. Anyway, it goes on to say, "Vayildov David hu v'arba'amot ish vayamdu 200 ish asher pigu me'avor et hanachal abso." So David runs with 400 men, soldiers. 200 stay behind by the Besor River. It's really a nachal. If you know the Negev, it's not all year round water, but during the winter time. Vayimtzu ish mitzri besadeh. And they find an Egyptian man in the field, and King David takes him and gives him bread. He says to him, "V'itnu lo pelach dveila u'shnei tzimukim." So he's giving him some figs and some whatever it is, raisins, and then he gets back the spirit to him, and he says 3 days he hasn't eaten, and then King David says to him, "Who are you?" And he says he's a Egyptian, a slave for a Maleki person, a servant. And basically King David, and he talks about how they Pashatnu Negev Akaritiv ala shel Yehuda ala Negev. He talks about what they've done, the burning down the city of different places, and the Tziklag, the city that David and his men had their wives. And David tells them, that King David says to him, "Are you going to bring me down to this regiment and swear to me?" And so the guy says, "Swear to me that you're not going to kill me." And he does, etc. And King David goes down there, and it says in verse number 17, "Vayakem David." King David strikes them, "Manesh ef ada erev," I mean from the total, around the clock until the next morning, and he kills all the Amaleks, and with his 400 men with him, and they saved the entire, their wives of King David's wives are saved, and all the wives, the men. Not one little child, no one was killed, and they were able to rescue all the hostages. And this is the story that's brought down in the book of Samuel. Fascinating story, of course, that describes again David's reaction, just similar to Abraham's reaction, to go immediately to the battle and to not to have any dealings with them, but they know only force, and to eliminate, to take back the hostages. Those are two very, very powerful examples in the Bible itself. I mentioned to you, of course, the example of Abraham. There's also another example that's brought down regarding in the book of Numbers. It says in Numbers number 21, verse number 1 to 3, it talks about the king of Arad, who, by the way, according to our sages, it was also Amalek, and they were also sitting in the south. And they were fighting with Israel, and they took also a hostage. There it says Shevi. There are different opinions if it's many or singular. Whatever it was, Israel right away, the same exact reaction. Israel swears, oath to God, if you give them in our hand, we will destroy, all their cities. We will give over, we will give over those cities to the, making a cherem. There are different meanings of the word cherem. Cherem can mean also to wipe out the cities, but also refers to giving over the city to the service of the temple, to God, where they would give certain things to the the uses of the temple. But whatever it is, I'm giving some examples. Yeah, we saw 3 very strong examples within the Bible, and of how clear hostage situations where the reaction was the same. There was no business dealings with the enemy, with the evil enemy, and as a matter of fact, we're talking about situations here of Amalek, right? 2 out of the 3 situations we're talking about here refer to Amalek, right? With Abraham, it wasn't talking about Amalek, but the other 2 situations are talking about Amalek. And the answer to deal with Amalek, with these evil forces these devil forces, subhumans, is to go strike them immediately. That's how you deal with them. That's what they understand. So here we see 3 biblical examples. I'd like to go now from the biblical aspect to some examples within the sages, a little bit amongst our sages later on in history, how our Jewish law relates to this. Just a couple of examples, and there's a very powerful story in the tractate of Gittin, and I'd like to read some of these stories, and these stories are read usually on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, the things that we're allowed to read, because you're not allowed to learn Torah on the day that our temples were destroyed, but you can learn things that's said in the heart, and one of them is some of these stories that we read about in Gittin in page 58, and I want to read, it's more than that, but here, this one's on page 58. Tanu Rabbana, we learned in a Braita, Maaseh Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. There was a story of Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, Shalach Likrach Gadol Sheberumi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, he was one of the rabbis of Rabbi Akiva. And he goes to a city in Rome, one of the big cities in Rome. Amrulo, and they told him, Tinok echad yesh beit hasurim. There's a child in prison in Rome. Yafei Inayim, he has beautiful eyes, V'tov Ro'i, a very, very beautiful child, Uktsotav Sdurot, Lo Taltem, he has curls, very beautiful hair, like this beautiful child. Halach v'amad al petach beit hasurim, and he went and he stood at the entrance of the jail, and he says to Mi natan le'mishisa Yaakov Yisrael levozazim. He quotes a verse from Isaiah 42, verse number 24, which says, "Minatan l'mishisa." How could it be that Israel is like is prey, right, to bozazim, to these people that are, bozes means to spoil, to take spoils, to those who are capturing. How could it be that these evil have our children? Israel has them in their hands, and the child answers, and he says, he finishes the verse in Isaiah. The second part of the verse in Isaiah says, Zu chatanu lo, that sin to God. V'lo avu b'drachav, they didn't want to follow his ways. Haloch v'lo shamu b'toroto, they went and they didn't want to follow his ways. V'lo shamu b'toroto, they didn't listen to his Torah. So the child is answering, the reason that you find Jews in captivity is because there was something wrong with us, that we weren't following Hashem's way, that he wanted us. So that's what the child answered. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya looks at the child and he says, I am 100% sure this child will be a great rabbi in Israel one day. And then, which is, so Avuken, this is what he says right away regarding him. And he says, Eini zaz mikan, I'm not going to leave this place until I redeem him with all the money in the war that they want me to offer, whatever it is. I will pay anything to get this child out of prison. And Amrulo, lo zazmi shamad shepedo b'mon harbein. He didn't leave until he was able to release the child with a great ransom. Many days didn't pass until this child grew up and he became one of the great rabbis of Israel. And this rabbi was Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So here we see a story, of course, an individual story of a child in captivity, and was released by Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. We have to understand what this is, how do we relate to this? I'm going to, bring this up. I'm going to summarize everything and bring it up in a moment, but I just wanted first to mention that first story here. So we see, of course, the anguish, and Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya is able to redeem this child, and of course, there was a great fear. The commentators explained that why did he have to mention he was a beautiful child? Let's say he wasn't such a beautiful child. But in reality, we don't look at the external, we look at the internal. But the answer was he was also, so some commentators say he was afraid that they were going to be, God forbid, use his child, as they've taken children, the evil devils, to abuse these children. And he was worried about them abusing him. And that's why he paid all the money in the world to release his child, because he saw this as something that was obviously, in any moment he's in danger. But anyway, that's one of the explanations. But if we go on, the Talmud continues in another story. And it's interesting because it's sort of a continuation. When he grew up, this child, and his name was Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha. And when he grew up, it says, Maaseh b'vno v'to shel Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha. He had a son and daughter that they themselves were taken captivity, his son and daughter. And they both were taken by two different owners, but they came to one place. And the two owners said, they didn't know that they were brother and sister. So they said, something, these two children are beautiful. Look how beautiful they are. Let's bring them together. They'll have beautiful children. Obviously, they have their reasons, obviously, to exploit this. So they want to bring them together so they can have children. These two, brother and sister. Of course, they don't know their brother and sister. And obviously, the brother and sister at this point didn't know themselves their brother and sister. And so they put them in a room, and it was each one in a corner. And before they even had a chance to see who each other was, pitch black, and they were each in a corner, and they were both contemplating. They said to themselves, I'm a son of a Kohen, a priest, and she was saying to us, I'm a daughter of a priest. So, it comes to such high esteem, and they're trying to put them together. They know very well what they want them to do. And they cried at night, and when the morning star came out, the sun rose, they both saw each other in each corner of the room, and they all fell on one another and started to cry until their souls left them. And this is the brother and sister in captivity. And again, I think the stories that are mentioned here are to give us the feeling of what it is for those in captivity, the terrible different kinds of suffering that they go through. Okay, there's one other story here I think I'll bring down from the Talmud here in Gittin before we connect to some other things. It talks about a woman who was named Tzofnat Bat Peniel, that was her name. And Tzofnat means to look, and everyone was looking at her beauty. And the daughter of Peniel she was a daughter of a high priest that served inside the Holy of Holies. And she was taken in captivity, and she was abused very, very badly. And after he abused her captive, he put on 7 different robes on her. And he took her out to the market to sell her. Ba'adam achad, and a person came, and he was so ugly. And he said, I want to see her beauty. So the person, the one that abused her the night before and wanted to sell her, said, you lowlife. Just, if you want to take her, there's no more beauty than this in the world. And he demanded, no, I first want to see her. So he began to remove 6 of her 7 garments. He removed all 6 garments. The 7th garment, she removed her own. She ripped it off herself. She jumped in the ground, in the soil, and she screamed, she shouted out to God, Ribono shel olam, Heaven, King, Master of the universe. Im aleinu lo chas, if you didn't have mercy upon us, on your holy name you must have mercy. Because what kind of disgrace that they're doing this to your children? And this is what Jeremiah says in chapter 6, verse 26. Bat Amim, the daughter of my nation, chigri sak, wear a sackcloth, vitpalshi be'efer, and just cover yourself with the dust. Evel yachid asilach, do like a mourning over an individual. Mispad tamurim, like a terrible eulogy. Ki pitom yavo shodei deleni, because suddenly the captive will come upon us. The one who wants to capture us. So basically we see here from these few different, and I brought down purposely very, very strong stories of what it is to be in captivity, what they represent, and the terrible tragedies that one goes through. So obviously, how do we relate now? Let's get to how do we relate to situations of such terrible tragedy, of captivity. And what is Israel supposed to do when 240 men, women, children, we spoke about adults, children, kids, Holocaust survivors. What is the nation of Israel, what is the government of Israel supposed to do? Are they following the Jewish law by making deals with these evil people? So we saw in the beginning reactions of, in the more biblical sources, right? How our forefathers responded by battle, and we're also battling. But is there allowed to do it in between, some kind of deal? As one of the deals we saw in the sixth portion of Lavan and Jacob. And we let him make deals with them. And there is something I want to get to from there to go over to more modern history. More modern history will be the Yimei Abinayim, the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there was a very, very famous, extremely sad happening as well, very, very famous, but of a rabbi named Rav Meir Rottenburg. Rottenburg's a city, he set up a yeshiva in Germany by the Tauber River, and that's where he set his yeshiva. He was born in Worms, Germany. He spent time in France. And a great giant. He was the rabbi of the Rosh, the famous Rosh, Rav Yitzchak Medura, the Mordechai. They're very famous rabbis. That he was like one of the greatest. He was the greatest scholar of his time. And he was arrested and put in prison. And why? Because he wanted to move to Israel in the Middle Ages. And he was born around the year, 1220. And he died, I think, around 73 years old, something like that, 73 years old. But he wanted to move to Israel, and then he was put into prison, and the German Caesar, the German leader, said, I'm not going to allow him to leave without paying a ransom of something like, what was it, I think 20,000 francs, a huge sum of money. And since he was a great scholar, you know, and everyone wanted to release him, he was placed, by the way, in a fortress called Ensheim, and how you pronounce it, Enziheim. The word Heim we can see is German for a home, right? I wonder what Enzi means. But whatever it is, Ensheim was the name of the fortress he was placed in. And basically, the rabbis came and they were all ready to pay the very high ransom, but he refused. He refused to allow them to ransom him. And he spent 7 years in prison, and he died in prison. Now, he was a great, tremendous rabbi, and eventually someone was able to allow one of his students to come to visit him, and he would describe how he didn't have any, of course, any books with him. He was in the dark, suffering terribly, but he was able to instruct and teach. Somehow, one great rabbi was able to come, and that was a miracle, to spend some time during those 7 years. But he died in prison because he was afraid, God forbid, he would endanger. If he would not, if he would allow them to ransom him, they would go ahead and take other rabbis hostage and then try to have them, buy them off, and it would endanger the lives of many others. So he was extremely self-sacrificing as a great saint he was, and he died in prison. Not only when he died, they didn't allow him to go to burial. They didn't want to bury him. It took 14 years until a very wealthy man, I think a man named Alexander Disting from Frankfurt in Germany, he was able to redeem the body after 14 years later to bring him to burial. So this is a terrible tragedy again in exile, a double exile, being an exile out of the land of Israel. Of course, he wanted to go to the land of Israel in the Middle Ages and also to suffer this and not to refuse to be ransomed. So we see his reaction of Rav Meir Rottenburg. Now, if we look of course, in the Jewish law, obviously this question comes down. I'm going to bring up some other sources of Jewish law. The Rambam Maimonides, he says right out that, talks about the greatness of the mitzvah, the commandment of releasing hostages and from people that are unfortunately in terrible situations of being in jail, imprisoned by the enemies. And we know that such a great mitzvah that brings about the redemption. There's a verse in Isaiah 35 that says, "Uvduyei Hashem yishuvun." Those, in exile will be brought back. They will come to Zion with happiness, right? So we know obviously that the coming back of Israel, even coming out of exile. Exile is, of course, all the Jews living outside the land. You know, it's a big mitzvah to redeem them, to get them out of there. That's also redeeming prisoners. And but anyway, the Mishnah brings down in Gittin that you're not allowed to, because of what we just saw before, you're not allowed to redeem those in captive more than the proper amount of money, like more than that it's really worth. In other words, not to over-exaggerate, because they're worried about exactly what Rav Meir was worried about. They're going to endanger others and charge huge ransoms and all that, right? And the Mishnah goes on to say you're not allowed to do like a special, to try to break them out of prison, because they're also worried about the fact that you break them out of prison, they're going to make the conditions much harsher for them, so you got to be very careful. Now this, and I want to of course clarify, it's very important to clarify these laws. Here, and this also brought to Shulchan Aruch, brings this all down to halacha as Jewish law. This refers to situations where those taken hostage in captivity were done so because of criminal reasons, right? Or reasons by the governments, you know, of just all greed over money and those kind of things. But we're not talking at all about situations of war. So we have to separate, and that's really a very important thing to draw the line, because obviously this question was asked to great rabbis, you know, throughout especially since the modern state of Israel was set up. And the war situations are totally different situations, and we have to put that and realize that situation. But here, the dry law that's referring to is individuals that are in prison, and therefore, regarding them, you know, we don't want this to, as Rav Meir said about himself, he's not willing to be redeemed for a high price because of what the problems going to cause later on. But there is a law that says that someone is like Gadol Adol, someone is like the head of the generation, and getting him out, you know, is such a loss by him being in prison, because so many people are missing out on his Torah, on his teaching, what he can bring. So for him, you're allowed to pay everything because of who he is, but he still refused that. He knew that he would be, on the dry law, allowed to be redeemed, but he did not want that to happen. But putting this all aside, war is different. Now, war is, it's obviously a totally different situation, because we're not talking about an individual scale now. We're talking about a scale of the nation of Israel, not dealing with just the word simple criminals that took someone for ransom, a kidnapping, but we're talking about kidnapping by evil forces, enemies of Israel, that have one goal in mind: to destroy us. And here, there is no clear-cut answer. You can say, okay, but we saw what King David did, and we saw how Abraham reacted, King David, and all the reactions in the Bible were to go to battle against the enemy. That's what Israel is doing. But the questions of your life, it doesn't, nowhere says we're not allowed to make a deal in order to save the lives of obviously, as much as lives we can save in between, of course. So this question is a great question, and not, you know, there's really no answer. It really depends. Jewish law says it depends on the leadership of Israel to make those great decisions. And of course, we don't have to make those decisions. Those who are not sitting in that cabinet of the war making those most difficult decisions now. But in reality, obviously we see different sides to it, because there's always on one side the personal pain and anguish that each family is going through, as opposed to the terrible results that can come out of this, you know, by making deals with the evil. Because we know in the past, the terrible terrorists that were released in the Gilad Shalit deal, they became actively involved in terrorism. They killed many Jews, lost their lives because of that. And the same thing here. I mean, all those terrorists are going to be released. Those terrorists, you know, attempted to murder, and actually talking about someone is one of them or two of them are living in the same neighborhoods that they did their criminal acts to the neighbor of the one they stabbed. So obviously it's a very, very complicated situation. On the other hand, every moment there's a danger of another one of the hostages dying, and their terrible situation. Israel made a decision. We have to stand with Israel in that decision they made here. But we have to also continue to strengthen Israel, to remember, you know, that we have to go all the way and eliminate the enemy. And therefore, if we look and we get strength from King David, and we see and that child that was in captivity that said, we have to listen to Hashem's word, a very simple answer. He became one of the greatest rabbis of Israel, and Rabbi Yeshua saw that in him. But you know, we have to strengthen our ways, how we serve Hashem in the world and what we're doing, and do reflection and self-reflection, because this is Israel's in a terrible situation. And we can't, people very quickly forget, it's just only a month and a half ago, whatever it was, people are already forgetting what was done and how much was suffering. And it's not over. We have a lot more work to do in Gaza until we totally eliminate the enemy there. We have a lot of work to do in the north with Hezbollah and with Iran and with the Houthis of Yemen and other enemies of Israel. Not to mention the pressure of the world coming against us. It's unbelievable. It's literally, we're in the wars of the end of days. But in this whole thing, I said we see in the air a lot of deals in this week's portion. We spoke about Jacob and the dealings going on, and it's sort of it's in there. We feel it in the atmosphere. We have no choice to do in certain situations. We have to, on one hand, be smart if we're able to quickly save some lives without, of course, at the same time endangering Israel and endangering our soldiers on the ground. And Israel, again, is extremely careful about what's going to be, and they're going to go back to, they say immediately after this deal is over, they're going back to finish the job. But we were praying for that, and it's a very, very difficult situation when you hear the sides of those who are victims of terror and afraid again, and those who are, their families are there right now. And all of us feel that. It's a hard thing. It's very, very difficult. But we have to stand in unification. We have to stand as one nation. That's the most important thing. The enemy gains power from a division. When they see Israel's divided, what happened in Yom Kippur and all those things that led to this thing, they saw the division amongst Israel, the terrible demonstrations against literally, it's hard to believe they came from Jews, against religion and that were going on in the country and all that. The division was so strong, but now there's a reversal in the country. Beforehand, it's always the small numbers of those making trouble, but in reality, the people of Israel, immediately their hearts open up to one another. You see, those in battle, they're from different parts of the country, all fighting together for a common goal, for our people. And that's something that's so beautiful to see. The love and kindness, the working together, and we will overcome the enemy. But this difficult situation, and the choice that was made, Israel made a choice with the Knesset, with the parliament, everyone's a right to their opinion, but this we have to walk with it. We can't now go against it. It's not going to help us anymore. They made the decision. Let's be with that and let them get strength from our forefathers that they can overcome and know how to continue to go to bash the enemy, and then, God willing, we will rescue the rest of the hostages, and we will complete the goals that were set aside, and even more so, that, God willing, we will return to our precious homeland of Gaza, which is the Jewish homeland, after this is all over, to resettle our people that were thrown out of their homes over there. Anyway, some reflections about the portion, some feelings. A very difficult time. Let us walk together, and we need every one of you to unite with us, to walk with Israel. Thank you for walking with us, for being with us, for supporting us at this difficult hour, and we will overcome. Shabbat Shalom, Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot, Benechamot.